place. That second group of people we talk about would not be a part of the administration at all. How much do you think there is credence to that mindset, that it would be an entirely different staff, and that would make a big difference if Trump were to return to the White House?
Absolutely. I think that the one thing Donald Trump has learned from his first presidency is not exactly how to govern, which is actually what a lot of presidents learn the first time through, like, I'm going to be a better executor of my will. Mm-hmm. What he learned instead is, I need to have more lackeys and loyalists. Remember, there were people who were incredibly supportive of Donald Trump going into his White House. These people turned on Trump. They basically didn't become his enemies, but they said, what he is proposing is so insane, I have to step in front of it. What Donald Trump has learned is he doesn't want any more guardrails. He doesn't want the risk of guardrails.
Mm-hmm. I want to talk for a minute just about some of the policy questions. Frank, the war in Ukraine, the war in Gaza have really dominated the last year or so of Biden's presidency. We saw this week in Michigan just how many Democrats have deep problems with his policies in Gaza and how that could be an issue for him in November. Going forward, both of these wars and the way that he's engaged in them seem to be at this inflection point. Have you put any thought into what a second Biden term could mean for Ukraine or for Gaza?
Well, foreign policy, I think, is the part of the job that he probably relishes the most. Talking to foreign leaders is his happy place. And I think that, going into a second term, it's very unlikely that Democrats are going to have control over both houses of Congress. So there's very little legislative possibilities for a second Biden term. I think that these wars are going to culminate in diplomacy. And so I think that would be the thing that he would have to pour himself into. I mean, there's going to be some sort of diplomatic end eventually to the war in Ukraine and the war in Gaza. And he hasn't gotten a whole lot of credit for what he's done by creating the possibilities of normalization between Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states, and Israel, and a plan for rebuilding Gaza. But that confrontation to kind of force the Israelis into some sort of long-term vision for coexistence is going to be, I think, the big question, the big confrontation that looms over the rest of this year, but I think it would spill into a second term.
Carol, in recent weeks we've seen Trump question NATO again. We saw him be very reluctant to criticize Vladimir Putin over Navalny's death. What do you think the most immediate consequences are for the war in Ukraine, for the war in Israel, if Donald Trump is sitting in the Oval Office again?
I think most Americans are not paying attention in a keen way to what Donald Trump wants to do about NATO and what the consequences are. Again, there were guardrails stopping him in 2018 from walking away from NATO, which he threatened to do in a meeting in Brussels. People with hair on fire who were his aides rushing literally down to the floor to try to intercede and make sure people understood in foreign diplomacy groups that no, we're not going to back out of NATO because you aren't meeting the 2% goal of defense spending. But Americans aren't focusing on that. Well, guess who is focusing on that? People all around the world. And leaders listened to Donald Trump's remarks the other day about inviting Putin in and encouraging Putin to invade countries that are NATO allies with a chill up their spine and planning for what they will do to create their own protection without the United States. I don't think we can say, as we sit here today, how this would affect what happens in the Middle East, because Donald Trump will, again, probably make a gut decision that he feels benefits him the most. But with regard to Ukraine, it's very clear. He's going to tell Putin, take whatever you want. Is there something else you'd like in that region? Go for it.
I want to shift back to end the conversation on the election a little bit. And I want to ask both of you what I kind of think is each of these guys' superpowers. And Frank, I'll start with you. Relevant to this coming election and where Biden stands in the polls right now, I think that Joe Biden has this unique ability to get people who don't especially like him or indifferent to him to come along and be with him at the last possible moment, whether that's passing legislation or whether that's going from the guy who's finishing in humiliating place in the New Hampshire primary to suddenly having the Democratic nomination wrapped up like 3 weeks later. Do you think that's a fair way to phrase his track record?
Yeah, he's somebody who still believes in persuasion in a world that's incredibly polarized, where everybody tends to just shout at the people on the other side. But I think his superpower, if I were to describe it as such, is that everybody talks about his empathy and the way that his empathy extends to somebody, a kid who stutters, or to people who've just lost their parents or a spouse. But really, his empathy is kind of the basis for how he deals with foreign leaders and how he deals with senators, that he's able to shelve his ego, which, to be fair, is quite considerable, and to kind of understand in an empathetic way, what somebody's political interests are, what emotional baggage they bring to a situation, so that he can conduct a negotiation. All of these qualities that are kind of so antiquated, that make Joe Biden feel like a figure who's out of time, are the ways in which he's able to make incremental progress, as he's done over the course of the last couple of years.
And Carol, I feel like Donald Trump's superpower is very different, but we are talking at the end of a week where once again he seems to catch every break possible. He wins big in South Carolina and Michigan. The Supreme Court decides to continue the pause on the federal January 6th trial, making it possible that this trial might not even happen before the election. I feel like so often he skirts from the catastrophic consequence at the last possible moment, either through luck or either through getting the people opposing him to be the worst possible version of themselves.
We'll talk about a comeback kid, right? I mean, in every negative Donald Trump, and I mean this over